Having tons of power and torque can be really useful, obviously, particularly when it comes to steep and technical climbs like we've got here. But knowing when and where to use that power and torque is quite an important thing when it comes to mastering technical terrain and having decent range on your e-bike. Right, so I'm riding my white Kado with a Bosch CX motor, but pretty much every motor has adjustability within an app. So this is where I do dig into it. I don't just sort of stick with what comes. And actually with this updated CX as well, that new eMTB Plus mode gives you more adjustability, but you also get loads of overrun now, which is super useful. We'll go into that into a minute. But it also differentiates it from the turbo mode. So actually in the turbo, I max out everything. So the assistance, the dynamic, so that really, as soon as you put your foot on the pedal, it jumps forward. And same with the torque, I've now maxed out at 100 Newton meters. And I've done exactly the same with the eMTB Plus. So that is all maxed out. So how I use them, turbo is my go-to for most climbs. Technical or not, it's just really useful obviously for bombing up those climbs as fast as possible and having like quite an easy assistance to judge almost, so I know what it's going to feel all the time. Whereas eMTB Plus is a bit more like automatic, which you get on some motors, where it jumps around or it changes its assistance depending on how much you're putting in. Obviously with this new Plus mode, it gives you that massive overrun. And I save that specifically for steeper climbs that have steps, just like this, because it'll keep that rear wheel spinning for a couple of meters. It can be really useful in these situations where you pedal up and over and then you can't crank because I'm gonna smash my pedals into the floor. The rear wheel will then drive me forward and get me up into the next spot where I can get back pedaling again. So I save the eMTB Plus for steppy uphills. Obviously with e-bikes now, it makes things like this so much more possible, that it's learning how to use your bike's power, but also there is a lot of skill to it as well. Steve Jones, my colleague, is very good at this. But what I found, particularly with steppy technical climbs, getting the seat down out of the way is just as important as going downhill, because you're going to need to throw your hips around for getting your weight up and over steps. Obviously, I'm trying to keep the rear wheel on the floor as much as I can, particularly with the overrun, just to keep it pushing me up the hill. So there's a bit of a trick there to using the rear wheel to drive and then timing it to pick it up, stick it back on the ground. And this step's a really good example because actually you run out of overrun. As soon as you get up it, you've got to get pedaling again and you're straight into other stuff. So it's taken me a bit of practice, but also learning how to use my skills and the bike as one. For a climb like this, which is much more like most of the climbing I do, but it's not overly technical, but it's quite steep and a bit loose, this is where I will use the turbo mode, so it's kind of a more consistent power output if I keep spinning at the same speed. And I'll actually ride with my seat kind of mid-level, like down a bit, but this is where you need to get the weight onto the front wheel. It's a real balance here, fore to aft, of trying to keep your rear tyre gripping, so keeping some weight on it, but also trying to keep the front wheel down. And that's where really perching on the front of the saddle works. And when things tip up really steep, that's when it becomes more uncomfortable, but it really works to get right to the front of the saddle and have it drop to bits. So you're keeping your weight low and forward to try and get up the steepest of those climbs. Something I do make use of quite a lot if I'm riding sort of a long, steep climbs is actually the lockout on my rear shock. If you can really firm it up, it's just gonna keep everything sort of tipped in the right direction. So you're not gonna sag in at the back, which actually sort of slackens out your seat angle and your head angle, which is great for downhill, not good for uphill. And actually it's easier to wheelie as well. So even if you might lose a bit of the rear suspension action, which maybe doesn't give you quite as good traction, actually just tipping the angles into the hill is gonna make it much easier on particularly steep climbs. Another place I don't like much overrun is cornering uphill, particularly when it's tight like a switchback. That makes it more difficult, I find, where you can't predict sort of the drive you're going to get, and sometimes you might want to stop pedaling for the bike to slow down. If the bike carries on, for one, you could lose your balance because normally these tight switchbacks, you're not going fast on them, even on an e-bike, and that's sort of going to start a chain of things happening. If you start going faster than you want, wider than you want, losing balance, it's likely that you're either going to stop or potentially even just have to put your foot down. So that's when I'll go to my full turbo. So it almost makes no sense, but like I said, less overrun on turbo, and I can predict where I'm going to be. Lots of the similar cornering skills, i.e. look into where you want to go, works really well for uphill corners. But yeah, planning where you're going to ride your line, but also because you haven't got much speed, it's really important to try and keep your weight above the bike so you don't lose your balance. Right, hill starts. I've had plenty of practice of this. When you lose traction and get stuck on a hill, using your bike's features can help you here as well. Isn't technology amazing? Some e-bikes actually have hill start assist, a bit like cars. We can't roll backwards. Actually, Amflow have that. It really confused me when I tried to move my bike around the garage first time, but actually, yeah, it won't let your rear wheel turn back, so the motor just sort of stops it. It can be really useful in situations like this where you want to get going again. So you can see, as soon as I put a bit of weight on the pedal, the bike wants to jump forward, which can again be also a bit tricky. But for hill start assist, it can be really useful as well, because the trick here is to try and put enough power into that one foot so that I've got enough time to get my other foot on and get going. Otherwise, obviously, I'll just stop and have to go again. So potentially a bit easier with flat pedals, but trying to line my rear wheel up somewhere with a bit of grip. One crank, get my foot on and try and keep them balanced. Right, a lot of cornering on, well, any bike really, but particularly off-road mountain bikes does involve moving your weight around. If you're thinking about the axis over your bike, like when you're leaning the bike, actually a lot of it, you think about moving your weight to the outside, which I'll get into in a bit. But particularly with climbing on an e-bike, it's where you want to keep your weight, you know, above the bike. So if you can keep it in the saddle, that can work really well, because like I say, at low speed, it's so much easier to just lose your balance. So if anything, I'm trying to sort of move my bum slightly to the outside of my saddle, but not a huge amount in these uphill switchbacks. But I'm also trying to keep a consistent sort of pedaling cadence and actually using my back brake on the e-bike, a bit like you would a clutch almost, because if you stop pedaling, it can be really jerky on and off. So that's when you can either lose your balance or lose traction on the rear tyre. So rather than that, I try and keep pedaling. And if I feel like I want to slow down, I actually just drag a bit of back brake, and that does the job for me. It's best to ignore the front brake, because if you grab that mid corner, it can really sort of just drop the bike over. So just think about back brake very gently and just feather it with your finger. So when it comes to riding downhill, there are situations where you can make the weight work for you. Yes, e-bikes are getting lighter all the time, but even the lightweight bikes are still heavier than your regular mountain bikes. And I think that does really help. If I remember my maths from school, momentum equals mass times velocity. So if you've got more mass, you've got more momentum. And on a regular mountain bike, often there'll be times where unweighting the bike, so hopping over things or just literally kind of getting your weight up and off the wheels, can be faster. So you're taking out these collisions. If you've got more weight, actually you get slowed down less by those collisions because you've got more momentum. So there are still times where you might want to hop your e-mountain bike over really rough terrain, but those collisions don't rob you of as much speed with an e-bike. So actually you save yourself an awful lot of energy if you're just planted and you're thrashing through the bumps. You're not having to use your big muscles to unweight the bike. It's less tiring and it can be just as fast. Also, where the weight is on an e-bike really helps it out. When we talk about sprung versus unsprung mass, basically all the sprung mass is the frame and everything that's bolted to it, including the motor and the battery that does weigh quite a lot. So the sprung mass of an e-bike is relatively good in relation to its unsprung mass, meaning that the suspension can work really well and play into your favour. So that sprung mass being larger when you compare it to a regular mountain bike basically means that your suspension just feels a lot better, it works better because there's more of an opposing force, and actually means the suspension is going to travel in easier. It doesn't make any difference to the way you set it up really. You still go for the same sag, which I'll do 30% sag on the rear, about 25% on the fork. Same for clickers, I don't think I need to change it for an e-bike particularly, but it just makes my suspension feel like it's working really well. So that is why e-bikes feel really good downhill. Where the weight doesn't work in your favour is when it comes to stopping the bike. And that's what I found with, well, when I first jumped on the e-bike, definitely, but also with newbies nowadays. I took James Pickering out from EMBN. He said that was one of the first things he noticed is trying to stop an e-bike. For him, felt difficult to begin with because you've got more weight, you're going to have to slow down earlier, or you set your bike up to sort of deal with it. So most e-bikes come with big brakes on them anyway. These Gear MT7s are super powerful, but you also need the grip to go with that. And actually at the moment, my bike isn't necessarily set up for that. I've actually got some Schwalbe Wicked Wheels, which are kind of virtually downcountry tyres. I've had them on this bike for a couple of videos, which you may have seen on the channel, where I talk about doing some epic rides. And in summertime, they are good enough, I've got to say, but particularly for this white Cader, they're probably, I'll maybe call it kind of being under-tired. You know, most of the time I run a big enduro tyre on this bike, something like a Schwalbe Magic Mary, because I want the grip to be able to slow this bike down fast. So at the moment I'm super fast rolling, but with the weight in these tyres, this bike does take like a bit of slowing down. So I have to think about slowing down earlier than I probably regularly would on this bike with different tyres or even a mountain bike. When it comes to cornering downhill on an e-mountain bike, there's no difference in skills when it comes to cornering a regular mountain bike, except for the things I've talked about before, whereas maybe thinking about slowing down a little bit earlier. But also you're probably going to have a bit more grip if you've got some good tyres to go on your e-bike. You can find a bit of weight, good tyres, you're going to find lots and lots of grip. So regular mountain bike skills, when it comes to hitting a big berm like this, where you've got loads of support, you're going to be putting a lot of force through the bike, almost sort of G'ing out. In these situations, you know, you always want to be looking around the corner, but this is where you want to stay flat. So actually feet level on the pedals. When it comes to flat coring, that's when you can start dropping your outside foot to get the weight low into the outside of the bike. But when you're compressing hard into a berm like this, you want to stay pretty central above the bike. Make sure you're looking to the exit. And maybe with an e-bike, it feels like you're kind of muscling the bike around a bit more just because of the extra weight and it wanting to go straight on. You're going to have to kind of throw your weight into the corner a bit more. But other than that, the skills are the same. Right, there's some of the skills I think you really need to take a look at for riding your e-bike and having a load of fun on it. We haven't done any skills videos in ages on the EMBN, so let me know in the comments if you've enjoyed it, but also if there's anything specific that you'd like to learn or improve. Jump in the comment section, I'll read them, and maybe I can make a video just for you. Thanks for watching. See you next time.